Hello everyone. Welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, we witnessed the intense duel between Xian and Dagruel. Xian's growth was astonishing as she held her ground against the normal form of Dagruel. However, Dagruel's strength extended far beyond that. After combining the power of his two brothers, Fen and Glassord, he unleashed his ancient might, forming a trinity and transforming into the ancient destruction giant TenSura. To counter this destruction god, storm dragon Veldora finally got his moment to shine. In this episode, we will dive into the battle between the true dragon and the giant god. So, let's get started. Lightning and thunder filled the skies as countless thunder pillars surrounded the battlefield. The destruction giant TenSura and storm dragon Veldora, both wielding the natural world's most powerful form of attack, lightning, were locked in a fierce clash. Because of their immense resistance, even the most devastating lightning, which could turn entire armies to ash, couldn't penetrate their skin. Nevertheless, both of them transformed their battle aura into thunderbolts that collided, creating massive lightning pillars that turned the battlefield into a living hell. In this chaos, the soldiers of both sides had anticipated the devastation and stopped their own fighting. They focused instead on maintaining their protective barriers, which prevented any casualties. However, as Dagruel and Veldora's battle intensified, it became increasingly difficult to keep those barriers intact. If the fight continued at this pace, there would be no witnesses left to observe this mythic-level battle. Instead, everyone might be swept up in the storm and reduced to ash. Luminous cursed Veldora, calling him a thoughtless, stupid lizard who never knew when to hold back, even though she understood he was trying to help her. Despite Veldora's good intentions, she couldn't help but feel annoyed, given how many times she had to clean up after his messes. Responding to Luminous' complaints was an unexpected voice, the leader of the 5 great warrior generals, for arms Basara. Basara expressed concern that if their leader Dagruel went berserk, it would be disastrous for their own troops. He had doubts about the strength of the giant's defensive barrier, so he had approached the barrier on Luminous' side to seek shelter. It was by chance that he overheard Luminous' complaints when their two barriers touched. Luminous noticed Basara and glanced in his direction. If this fight continued, both sides would face devastating consequences due to the weakening strength of their barriers. At that point, only a handful might survive. On Luminous' side, with powerful beings like Xian and Ultima, they stood a better chance. But the giant race, on the other hand, faced the very real threat of total annihilation. Although Luminous harbored ill feelings toward Dagruel due to historical grudges, she did not want to see the destruction of the giant race as collateral damage in this battle. There was only one solution. Luminous hesitated for a moment, but then made up her mind. She suggested that Basara's giant army join forces with her side to maintain the barrier together. If they wanted to survive this mythic battle, they needed to pool all their strength and reinforce the defense together, with Xian enhancing the barrier. This proposal, transmitted through the barrier's contact, reached the minds of everyone on the battlefield. It's difficult for enemies to suddenly cooperate in the midst of a battle, but if they didn't, everyone would die. Basara understood this well, and in fact, this proposal was more beneficial to the giants, as it essentially offered them salvation. With the giants' assistance, it would be much easier for Xian to strengthen the barrier too. Basara, recognizing Luminous' kindness, did not hesitate to accept her proposal, ensuring that everyone on the battlefield would have a chance to survive this impending catastrophe. Shifting back to the battle between Veldora and Dagruel, Dagruel controlled seismic waves to trigger earthquakes and manipulated air currents to summon hurricanes, but these had no effect on Veldora. The storm dragon, being the embodiment of natural phenomena, could not be defeated by the forces of nature. Of course, Dagruel was aware of this. As longtime adversaries, they were very familiar with each other's strengths and weaknesses. However, this was the first time Dagruel had fought Veldora in his fully unleashed TenSura form. Dagruel felt his blood boil with excitement. Now was the perfect moment to bring their long-standing rivalry to an end. Now, in this TenSura form, Dagruel had 3 heads and 6 arms, leaving no vulnerabilities. His magic nullification and hardening transformation rendered his body stronger than anything, making him impervious even to attacks from mythic weapons. Yet, despite facing such a formidable opponent, Veldora remained as composed as ever. He showed neither fear nor overconfidence. He was simply fully prepared for the battle ahead. This was the stance of a true warrior. Veldora also knew that if he lost here, Luminous, Xian, and Ultima wouldn't survive either, and he would never allow that to happen. Even though Veldora usually enjoyed joking around, this time, he was entirely serious. Veldora unleashed Thunderstorm Roar, a strange beam from the storm dragon's mouth, laced with lightning, hurtling toward Dagruel. Dagruel dismissed it with a punch, mocking Veldora for using such a meaningless attack. But Veldora wasn't fazed by the taunts. He used this opportunity to have his parallel existence circle around behind Dagruel and launch his real attack, Dragon Claw. Though the claws Veldora extended didn't match the size of his massive dragon body, they possessed a severance ability capable of slicing through any material in existence. Dagruel countered with a punch, his hardening ability clashing with Veldora's severance ability. A violent explosion ensued, and when the smoke cleared, it was revealed that Dagruel had lost an arm in the exchange, while Veldora's left claw had also been severed. However, Dagruel's arm quickly regenerated, and since the Veldora that lost the claw was merely a parallel existence, neither fighter was at a disadvantage. Veldora sarcastically remarked on how unfair it was that Dagruel's already hardened body could also regenerate. Dagruel responded by saying that it was Veldora who was the unreasonable one, being able to inflict damage on him in the first place. The two combatants grinned at each other as if reveling in the fight, and their attacks became even more ferocious. Yet Veldora knew this wasn't the time for amusement. His regular attacks weren't effective against Dagruel, and it wouldn't be wise to unleash his strongest attack without a guarantee of success. Both of them wielded such overwhelming power that whoever got impatient first was likely to lose. The strategy required them to wait for the perfect moment when the opponent let their guard down to strike a fatal blow. However, Veldora decided to ignore that logic, opting instead for a relentless offensive. He created countless clones of himself, not parallel existences this time, but mindless clones pre-programmed with specific instructions. These clones surged toward Dagruel, their vibrating wings sending out countless wing blades that sliced everything around them, creating a spherical death trap. Dagruel remained calm, but it wasn't he who reacted first. Glassword, one of his 2 brothers, took over the front-facing position, wielding a colossal sword over 10 meters long. Moving faster than the speed of sound, Glassword created an impenetrable sword domain, cutting down every one of Veldora's clones as they approached. Immediately after, Fen took the lead, unleashing his special technique, Binding Lock of Obliteration. Even gods couldn't escape from the divine chains known as Gleipnir. Combined with Dagruel's true eye, which allowed him to pinpoint Veldora's true body amidst the countless clones, their teamwork was flawless. Glassword destroyed the clones, Dagruel identified the real Veldora, and Fen ensnared him, ensuring that no matter where Veldora hid, he couldn't escape. However, something strange happened. The entity Dagruel captured was still one of Veldora's fake clones. Dagruel was baffled. How could Veldora possibly deceive his true eye? It was an utterly incomprehensible situation. Meanwhile, Veldora grew more and more smug, proudly declaring that even with his newfound powers, Dagruel could never surpass him. Veldora boasted that the current version of himself was vastly different from his past self, and that he had grown tremendously. Unsurprisingly, this over-the-top bragging managed to confuse Dagruel further, successfully planting seeds of doubt in his mind. The truth was, Veldora couldn't truly escape the scrutiny of Dagruel's true eye. However, Veldora's ultimate skill, Lord of Chaos, possessed the authority of probability manipulation, which allowed him to instantaneously swap places with one of his clones. Thus, evading Dagruel's attacks was effortless for him, even fooling the most powerful analytical skills. This ability was one of Veldora's trump cards, useful in almost any situation. And as Veldora had said, he had indeed grown stronger and had been diligently training. Though Veldora didn't fully grasp the intricate mechanics behind his abilities, he had instinctively learned how to use them. Luckily for him, if he had understood the finer details, he would have boasted about them long ago, which would have given Dagruel a chance to counter them. Dagruel acknowledged Veldora's growth and stated that since that was the case, he would end their battle using his most powerful technique. As he spoke, Dagruel manipulated interference waves to ensure that no clones existed outside his confirmed range. Then, he sliced through the dimensions, creating an entirely isolated space in which only he and Veldora existed. Veldora sensed that something was wrong, but it was already too late. With a maniacal laugh, Dagruel declared that the time had come to sever the bond of their long-standing conflict once and for all. At that moment, he unleashed his ultimate technique, Quasar Break. Inside the sealed-off space, violent tremors began to shake the area. Centered on Dagruel, irreversible interference waves filled the isolated dimension, and a brilliant light erupted. Then, Dagruel sacrificed 60% of his magicule supply to transform his body into a black hole-like entity, starting to absorb all the matter within the space. Everything was first broken down by vibrations that transcended dimensions, then swallowed by the black hole. No matter how powerful a life form was, it would be disintegrated in this space, becoming nourishment for Dagruel. It was a terrifyingly surreal scene, like a nightmare come to life. However, due to the massive energy consumption, this attack was a double-edged sword. Dagruel could only use it once for a certain time, and the absorbed energy was largely used to maintain his own existence. Otherwise, even Dagruel himself would be blown away by the aftermath. As Dagruel absorbed the surrounding matter and maintained his existence, he finally deactivated his ultimate technique, confident in his victory. The Quasar Break had caused catastrophic damage, destroying the isolated dimension. Dagruel absorbed it, returning to the original dimension. Even the residual energy left behind was enough to warp and distort space. Over time, the surrounding area would slowly return to its original state, but the marks left by such immense destruction were indescribable. Dagruel was certain that, even though Veldora was a true dragon and might eventually resurrect, this battle was undoubtedly his victory. However, at that very moment, a familiar, exaggerated laugh echoed once more. Yes, Veldora was not dead. He exclaimed how dangerously close he had been to death. Hearing Veldora's voice, Dagruel momentarily wondered if he was hallucinating. There was no way anyone could survive his Quasar Break. This move was so potent that Dagruel hadn't even dared use it against the creator god Veldonava, as it was nearly impossible to control. Only after his growth into his current form could Dagruel master it. Veldora had been trapped in a different dimension with no escape. How could he have survived? Dagruel was utterly baffled. Veldora, however, laughed boastfully, claiming that such an attack was no big deal for someone like him. Yet, Veldora's physical condition told a different story. The storm dragon's 2 pairs of wings were tattered, and his body had sustained severe damage. Due to the lack of energy required to maintain his existence, his magicule was beginning to leak. In truth, Veldora had narrowly escaped death. He managed to survive the sustained attack only by using the probability manipulation of his Lord of Chaos skill, diluting the probability of his existence to the extreme to evade the destructive energy waves. It was as if the energy wave had passed through his body, allowing him to avoid the annihilating force. However, this was far from a flawless escape. All of his clones had been destroyed, and even his main body had suffered significant damage. The fact that Dagruel's Quasar Break had forced a true dragon to this extent was a testament to just how terrifyingly powerful the skill truly was. If this had been the old Veldora, there's no doubt he would have been obliterated. And if Dagruel were able to unleash Quasar Break again, Veldora certainly wouldn't survive. However, Veldora had already calculated that Dagruel no longer had enough energy to use the skill a second time. In fact, the entire course of the battle had been within Veldora's control. The magicule leakage Veldora displayed was a deliberate act, meant to deceive Dagruel into thinking he was more wounded than he truly was. His previous reckless attacks without any regard for strategy were also part of the act, all to make Dagruel underestimate him. Veldora's overall strategy was simple. From the start, he knew that, with Dagruel having over 110 million existence points, his own 90 million existence points would put him at a disadvantage. Although Veldora still believed himself to be stronger, they were close enough in power that the battle could go either way. For Veldora's ultimate technique to have any chance of defeating Dagruel, he first needed to drain Dagruel's energy. So, Veldora created the illusion that he intended to drag the battle out, which prompted Dagruel to use a massive move to end the fight quickly. Of course, to withstand Dagruel's Quasar break, Veldora also expended a significant amount of energy. Coupled with the energy previously drained by Xian and Luminous, Veldora was left with only 50% of his original strength. But Dagruel was in an even worse condition, having used up 70% of his energy. He now had less than 40% remaining. The tide had turned in Veldora's favor. Though Veldora had successfully gambled and won, the sheer power of the Quasar break left him shaken. One wrong move, and he could have been the one obliterated. Dagruel's strength far exceeded what Veldora had anticipated. But the reason Veldora dared to gamble his life was that, even in defeat, he knew he could be revived through Rimura's powers. Although Rimura seemed to have vanished from this dimension, Veldora knew deep down that Rimura had not perished. This certainty was why Veldora never believed he would truly lose. On the other hand, Dagruel had no knowledge of Veldora's ability to revive, which is why he couldn't comprehend why Veldora was willing to engage in such a risky, seemingly suicidal strategy. After all, Dagruel didn't harbor any personal enmity toward Veldora. He wasn't fighting to the death, and given Veldora's personality, he had expected Veldora to surrender the moment he was trapped in the alternate dimension. Had Veldora surrendered, Dagruel would have gladly let him go. There was no real reason for the two old friends to kill each other. Dagruel voiced his confusion aloud, and Veldora responded by declaring that the word escape did not exist in his dictionary. Of course, this was a blatant lie, but no one bothered to point it out. If Veldrind had been present, she would have surely given Veldora a stern lecture about it. Veldora finally spoke his true thoughts. He admitted that he wanted to test his own strength, but more importantly, if he fled, Luminous, Xian, and the others would face total annihilation. And if that happened, Rimura would be furious. Dagruel stared in disbelief, not quite understanding Veldora's logic. Veldora continued, laughing heartily as he said that an angry Rimura was something to be feared. Although Dagruel couldn't fully grasp Veldora's reasoning, one thing was clear: Veldora had grown and had learned to take responsibility. Then, Dagruel amplified his aura, his massive body, previously over 20 meters tall, shrinking down to a height of about 2.5 meters. As his size diminished, his energy density surged. His entire form crackled with lightning, emanating a different kind of power. This was a technique Veldora had casually mentioned from his favorite manga. Although Veldora had shared it in passing, Dagruel had remembered it, and through intense training, had mastered it. Dagruel named this new form Super God Transformation, an advanced state beyond his giant form. Thanks to Veldora's idle remarks, Dagruel had achieved this level of mastery. Veldora, too, reverted to his human form, compressing his energy as well. For spiritual beings, energy density was crucial, and a fist carrying that compressed power could shatter any material in the world. Dagruel and Veldora launched into a fierce brawl, exchanging blows that echoed with tremendous impact. Their fists and kicks collided with such force that even the dimensions around them rippled. From the skies to the ground and even beyond the atmosphere, their battle transcended normal boundaries. For beings as extraordinary as they were, the location of the battlefield didn't matter. Their attacks intersected, and the torrents of energy they unleashed ravaged everything in their vicinity, a truly awe-inspiring spectacle. Luminous watched, overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the fight. Although the devastation surrounding her caused her some anxiety, she understood that it was inevitable. Lightning pillars stood across the landscape, turning everything they touched to ash. The multiple protective barriers safeguarding the holy capital had long since failed, and even the long wall, which had once held back the desert, had vanished. Now, the only thing holding back the destruction was the barrier centered around Xi'an, a collective effort from everyone to maintain their last line of defense. It was almost miraculous that they had survived this long. But at this rate, the collapse of the barrier would be inevitable, and when that happened, their fate would be sealed. Everyone could see that the destruction of the city center was only a matter of time. Of course, the reason why such destruction had not yet occurred was that Veldora had been deliberately minimizing the damage caused by Dagruel's attacks in his own way. Luminous, although reluctant to admit it, couldn't deny that Veldora had indeed grown significantly, and the others also praised Veldora Sama's strength and greatness. Luminous once again turned her gaze toward the sky, deeply captivated by the ongoing battle. In fact, everyone present was mesmerized. This was a myth-level battle, an extremely rare sight that might only happen once in a million years. However, some might wonder, how could Veldora fight so evenly in close combat against the three-headed, six-armed giant god? The reason was that during his time in the labyrinth, Veldora had never given up on his training. To maintain his dignity as the final boss of the labyrinth, he had been diligently honing his skills every day, often engaging in special training sessions with Zijin. As a result, he had mastered top-tier combat techniques. The grandeur of the battle made it feel as if it could last forever. Yet, Veldora was merely waiting for the right opportunity, and having spent so much time with Rimuru, Veldora had adopted some of his cunning and sly tactics. As Rimuru often said, victory is determined before the battle begins, emphasizing that preparation is key. Therefore, Veldora had prepared one or two secret techniques before the fight even started. Dagruel, too, was astounded by Veldora's growth. He had thought he had reached the pinnacle of both strength and skill, but after fighting Veldora, he realized there was still room for improvement. While Dagruel praised Veldora's prowess, both fighters had their own reasons for refusing to back down. For Dagruel, retreat was not an option, and for Veldora, there were things he could not afford to let slip. Thus, the battle continued. In this world where the strong devour the weak, the rules were determined by the powerful. For Veldora, the goal was simple: to claim victory in this place and stop Dagruel. He decided it was time to use his hidden trump card. Dagruel immediately sensed the shift and prepared his defenses. However, Veldora had already activated his ability. In an instant, a red-black darkness expanded at an alarming rate, enveloping all of Rubrios and the neighboring desert. This was Veldora's ultimate technique, Fertile Paradox. Luminous realized the danger far too late. She had no means of resistance, and could only watch as the red darkness seeped into the barrier. However, she keenly sensed that this was a mysterious, divine power. Yes, Fertile Paradox was a power akin to a prayer. It promoted the recovery and growth of life, a healing force that was the opposite of destruction. It could not be resisted, nor could it be refused. Even Luminous was not immune. Before she realized it, she had already been engulfed by the darkness. Everyone touched by it was drawn into a deep sleep, and as their lives rested, green sprouts began to emerge from the ground. Time passed, and Veldora stood at the center of the darkness, looking down at the three brothers, Dagruel, Glass Sword, and Fen. Glass Sword seemed relieved, Fen turned his head in frustration, and Dagruel, at the center, calmly asked Veldora if he had turned the three brothers into the nutrients to nurture this world. Veldora replied that calling it nurturing might be an exaggeration, but he had indeed manipulated the situation a bit. Veldora's nonchalant attitude irked Dagruel, but there was nothing he could do. The three brothers' limbs had already fused with the massive trees that now towered over the land, rendering them immobile. Veldora explained to Dagruel that he had simply restored the land, which had been polluted by magicule, back to its original state. Magicules had different forms, sharp and aggressive when used for attacks, but they could also return to their calm, stable essence. Dagruel's territory had been left barren due to the influence of Milim's aggressive magicule. If that could be reversed, the land would flourish like the Jura forest. However, not even Dagruel could undo that devastation, and other demon lords were equally powerless to neutralize Milim's destructive force. Even Luminous, who specialized in holy powers, couldn't calm the overwhelming chaos of Melim's magic. Had that been possible, perhaps Dagruel and Luminous might have reconciled sooner. In other words, it seemed impossible for a person to trigger such a transformation in magicules. They would simply have to wait for time to do the work. Yet, somehow, Veldora had achieved the impossible. Fertile Paradox was not an offensive ability in the traditional sense, but instead bestowed Veldora's blessing upon the land. It harmonized the chaotic magicule, using those who had once been agents of destruction as nourishment to promote the growth of life. Of course, this incredible feat was made possible in large part by the fact that Dagruel and his brothers were at the core of the process. They, who were once embodiments of destruction, violent gods of devastation, had now become natural gods, a missing part of the planet's balance. However, this also meant that the three brothers were now sealed within the land itself, and only Veldora possessed the power to break that seal. Dagruel angrily remarked that he never expected Veldora to become so cunning and underhanded. Veldora laughed heartily, claiming he'd take that as a compliment. Of course, Veldora assured Dagruel that he didn't intend to seal him forever. Once the Great War ended and Veldora found Rimuru, he would release Dagruel. By then, Dagruel's divine aura and the polluted barren land would have healed, eliminating the need for conflict with Luminous. Veldora estimated that it would take no more than a few decades to locate Rimuru, and by that time, the three brothers of Dagruel would no longer pose a threat. Dagruel was even more shocked, not because Veldora would release him, but because the once unreliable Veldora had noticed the dire situation of Dagruel's country and people. Veldora, feigning ignorance, mentioned that Dagruel must be referring to the barren land that, in a few hundred years, would run out of water, becoming uninhabitable even for the giants. Veldora added with a casual shrug that he didn't really care about that, even though he clearly understood the gravity of the situation. He knew there were no young soldiers or women and children left in Dagruel's chained giant army, only warriors ready to die in battle. Dagruel let out a bitter laugh, realizing Veldora had long seen through everything and had cleverly solved the problem while pretending to play dumb, not wanting Dagruel to feel indebted to him. Dagruel, laughing heartily, was undoubtedly Veldora's friend. Long ago, after being defeated by Veldonava, Dagruel had taken on the responsibility of guarding the Heaven Tower, the path to the Star Palace. However, after the Melim rampage, the land became barren. Dagruel had no choice but to accept his fate and watch his territory wither. After being defeated by Fen, he reflected on the past and decided to gamble one last time, by challenging Luminous territory. If he succeeded, the giant race might find hope. If he failed, the losses in battle would leave fewer mouths to feed, giving the survivors a chance to stretch their resources. Either way, there would be change. That's why Dagruel, despite knowing he would be branded a traitor, accepted Fen's proposal. While he was willing to sacrifice himself, he couldn't allow his descendants to bear the burden of this catastrophe. Though he felt guilty toward Luminous, Dagruel had no choice. Veldora, understanding Dagruel's reasoning, commented that this world was survival of the fittest. What Dagruel didn't understand was why Veldora chose to help him. Veldora, not wanting Dagruel to feel indebted, playfully responded that he just wanted to prove that he was stronger than Dagruel. Besides, if the surrounding lands prospered, Luminous would be pleased too. He then sheepishly admitted that he hadn't intended to cover the entire barren land but had accidentally done so in his efforts. Dagruel laughed heartily again, deciding not to feel indebted to Veldora for the favor. Veldora remarked that friends shouldn't owe each other anything and mentioned that the two of them would continue sparring in the future, where he would show even greater strength. Dagruel, not one to back down, asserted that he wouldn't lose twice to a mere lizard. The two exchanged a knowing smile, one that only old friends could understand, and with that, the tension between them was finally dispelled. However, at that very moment, an unexpected figure appeared within the special space. It was a beautiful woman with flowing blue hair, Veldora's sister, Scorched Dragon Veldrind. Veldrind commented that the situation here seemed resolved, so perhaps it was time to discuss the next problem. Veldora immediately lost his relaxed demeanor, nervously asking why Veldrind was here. Velgrind reassured him and then turned her attention to the three brothers, saying that compared to the matter now settled, there was a more pressing issue. Melim had attacked the Heaven Tower again. Velgrind's words left the three brothers stunned. With the giant army fully deployed, only a handful of women and children, the future of the giant race, remained at the Heaven Tower. If it were attacked again, the entire giant race could face extinction. Alright, that's all for this video. Veldora's growth was even more evident in this episode, especially with how he thoughtfully ensured that Dagruel didn't feel indebted to him, showing him to be a surprisingly considerate and warm-hearted character. His power increase goes without saying, whether it was drawing Dagruel into his rhythm or cleverly evading a fatal strike. Veldora displayed the level of skill expected from one of the world's top-tier existence. Personally, I feel that Veldora's strength during this period may have even surpassed that of his older sister, Velgrind. I'm curious to know what you all think. In our next episode, Dagruel and his brothers will be deeply regretful for being deceived by Feldway. Of course, they will no longer be able to contribute much to the ongoing battle. With the connection between the other world and the central world broken, Ivaric's impending arrival is unavoidable. As this massive crisis approaches, Luminous, Velgrind, Masayuki, Hinata, Ultima, and others will unite the people of the world in their own ways to face the challenge together. Meanwhile, Zelenus is scheming his next move. What will Vega and Dino's team do next? The upcoming episode will be just as thrilling. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.